Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our third IRMS Public Sector monthly webinar. I'm Elizabeth Barber and I chair the group. I'd like to say a huge thank you to Sarah, who has managed the last two sessions because I needed to take time out. So huge thank you to Sarah, and also for dealing with all the technical aspects which are way beyond me. So many thanks to Sarah for making all this happen.
Oh, my pleasure, Elizabeth. My pleasure.
So this afternoon, we're going to hand over to Scott in a moment to talk about ROPA retention schedules and information asset registers. And having seen a brief outline of the presentation, I think we're in for a wonderful hour of all sorts of exciting record management things. So I'd like to say welcome to everybody. If we could keep or any questions you may have, if you could put them on the questions tab, because Sarah's going to field the questions, and anything else in the chat function. And obviously we're all professionals, I don't really need to say this, but if we can keep the chat healthy and wholesome, that would be really good as well. So without any ado, I'm going to hand over to Scott, whom I'm sure that most of you know as he's now the immediate past chair of the IRMS, but he was chair for what must seem like many years. So I'm going to hand over to Scott now to carry on without any further ado. So over to you, Scott.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you for having me. This is the first one I think I've done as a speaker and not as a host or anything else. So this is going to be exciting. Small details. I'm already having some technical issues this morning. So, you know, me and technical issues seem to go together at the moment. That's why you'll notice that there's me talking here, and then there's a little thing called Scott's presentation, and I'm using my gaming PC to actually deliver the presentation. So if I look like I'm using both hands and multitasking, that's why. So thank you very much for having me. Elizabeth asked, share me some choices. So you can talk about this, talk about this. I went, let's talk about ROPA and information asset register, because it's one of my favourite topics. I've talked about it ever since I was at Essex County Council and we did loads of work around retention and ROPA. I even went to a pensions conference and talked about information asset management and ROPA at a big pensions conference, and that was they were geekier than I am, so that was a fascinating experience, that was. So for those of you that know me, I've been with the Society volunteering with the Society for about 8 years. I've been in the world of information governance for about 11 years now. Started off in local government, then went various different places, spent a little bit of time in legal and medical, then went back to Essex for a couple of years before going independent last year. As well as being a bit of an information geek and volunteering my spare time with the Society and making a business out of it, I also hold a couple of qualifications in neuro-linguistic programming and counselling, because I find human behaviour and psychology fascinating. So as well as having my own drinking habit, as well as giving up my spare time to do information and records management, and as well as having a range of stuffed toys that go with me when I used to travel a lot, including Yoda and Privacy Puss, I think it's safe to say I don't get out much. So that's me. So what I want to do is, I've never done a session where I've done what they call evangelical stuff, where I've talked about how we can do certain things and thrown ideas out there for discussion. Proper this is a good idea, what do you think of this, what do you think of that, and just thrown some ideas around for discussion. It's generally just been, you know, in the past it's been, this is what the content is, or this is what data protection says, or this is what that says, blah blah blah. But what I want to do is talk about, for all three, yes, what they contain, so what records of processing is about, what your retention schedule should be about, your information asset register and other things, but how they can work together, and how we can throw some ideas out there around how we can get them to work together, how we can work towards what good records management or what good information records management is in its entirety looks like. Share some good ideas. So I'm going to ask you some things. So if you want to share in some things that work for you, that don't work for you, some challenges that work for you and don't work for you, all those sorts of things. Just throw it all into the mud and have a proper evangelical session. And the only evangelical image I could get that made sense, well, it seemed to fit with my approach to life, was Father Ted. So, you know. So, when I talk to people around information asset management, their information asset register, their records of processing, their retention schedules, their other things, often people say it's quite difficult. It's difficult to get the business involved. It's difficult to get staff to do. It's difficult to then try and bring this stuff together because the authority is either too big or the business is too complicated or whatever. It's a challenge. And one of the things that I found quite motivating when I go and do information asset management work, because it is a challenge, it's not the most exciting work on the planet, but I found this actually quite motivating. I say, well, actually, we're doing it because this is what we do. This is what we're about. This is what we are. This is what we're for. So if we can't get motivated about it as the information and records managers, or as the information and records management team, or the IG team, or whatever you want to call yourself, then by Jove, the business won't do it either. Therefore, we've got to be passionate about it. We've got to be positive about it. We've got to go out there and try and find ways of making it work. If we've already said in our head, we've defeated and said that's too difficult, because that's not going to happen, funnily enough, it won't happen. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So let's start with records of processing. This was kind of the one that threw information asset management into the fore. Everyone then went, we've got to do information audits, we've got to find out what we're doing, we've got to find out what's what. And then as we learned more and more about what are records of processing activities under Article 30 of the GDPR was like, what the expectations are, and then more specifically, what the ICO's expectations are, and there is slight difference between the two, that it threw information and management into the fore and then started throwing some things into the mix. Everyone approaches this in different ways. Some people have already blended their information asset register and their records of processing together. Some people have it as separate tabs in a spreadsheet. Some people have systems. Everyone's doing it in different ways. And for the minute, I would put out there that there isn't one right way of doing it. There is goods and bads of various different things. So like there's a one trust system, there's some goods and positives with that. There's another system, there's some goods and positives and negatives with that. There's the Excel spreadsheet, there's some positives and negatives with that. So they all do different things for different people. So what I want to try and do is throw into the mix what some of the positives are and what some of the negatives are from all of you, plus some of the stuff that I've been seeing with the people that I work with. And you can then get a feel for what good looks like. And then if you go your own way and you want to do what you want to do for your organization, you know what good looks like, what the good elements are, so you can pick the bones out of it and make it work for you. So in terms of what ROPA wants, so your records of processing, that's saying to you, right, you need to keep a record of what your purposes are for using personal data. What are you using it for? So you need to keep a record of that. Okay, that's one element. Another element is you need to keep a record of what controllers you've got. So who are the controllers for your information? So your business entities, your legal entities, if your public authority owns other authorities or other entities, what they are, everything that's within your remit. If you're a processor, you keep a record of the controllers that you're doing work for. So your suppliers or your buyers almost. You then got the data subjects, so the types of data subjects you're processing personal data on. Are they citizens? Are they family members of citizens? Are they other staff, volunteers, witness givers? What are they? They could be anything. So what are the data subjects that you're processing personal data on? What are the types of personal data that you've got? So what exactly is it that you're processing? Is it just personal data and you've got no need to go near special category data, or is it a blend of the two? And for each purpose, then what are you processing? The retention, how long you're going to keep it? Any transfer of it, so where it physically is in the world and what sort of controls you're putting in place. Any disclosures of it to third parties, so any sharing with third parties. Your technical and organizational measures that you're putting around that data. So at face value, not a lot, but actually when you start delving into it, it can be quite a lot of stuff there. So your reason for why you're using personal data is that information also in your information asset register. Because when you're asking questions around, well, why are you using this particular database, Excel spreadsheet, storage of payslips, whatever, it comes with a purpose. Is that a data protection purpose? Is it something that could fit under a data protection purpose? So I might have multiple assets that might fit under one purpose, or does it actually reveal to me multiple purposes? What is that? So already we've got a link. We've got a link between your disclosures, so where I am sharing information with a third party. If that's just a third party does, I don't know, provides payroll, then they're my suppliers, so that might exist on a supplier database. But if I'm actually doing physical sharing, so sharing with the police, with, I don't know, a law firm, whatever, where does that record sit? Does that sit on their file, or are you looking to store it on the ROPA database? And then how do the two talk to each other? Is it actually better that it sits on the file rather than the ROPA database? Therefore, how do you join the two together? And how do you make sure that when someone asks for it, say the ICO or the data subject, that you can link the two together? Now, I'm posing a lot of questions and throwing a lot of questions out there, and hopefully as we go through, we'll start to answer some of those. So bear with me. Bear with, caller, bear with. Other bits could be your list of controllers. Well, you could keep that in ROPA. Some company secretaries for more organizations tend to keep it with this company secretariat. For public authorities, there might be someone in legal that actually keeps a record of what legal entities you've got and all the different registrations you need to do for all of them. Therefore, is your ROPA as up to date as that list? Can those two talk together? Or can those two actually be the same list? How do those two work together? The data subjects or types of person data that you're processing on, a lot of that information might come from your asset registers. Therefore, does one feed the other? So does your information asset registers, do they then feed the types of data subject that you've got and you can put them into categories? Or do you actually say, no, the data categories is listed in my ROPA and the information asset register pulls from that? So it's selection. So when you're filling in your asset and what your asset requires or is using, you then pull from a list. And if what you want to use is not on that list, does that kick off a process for a DPIA or a something else? Because it's something that's not been done before. You're not aware of that. Therefore, it's new. Therefore, if you want to start processing something on, I don't know, social care user relatives, we've not collected that before. We've not had that before. Therefore, why are you collecting that? Does that require an assessment? Those sorts of things. Does that kick off a process? Same thing with your transfers. Where do you keep a record of that? Is that something that you keep in your ROPA because you want to manage it from a data protection point of view? Or is it something that actually, again, your asset registers draw down from or feed into? If they feed into, then people can create anything. I'm now sending stuff to India. Okay, fine. Therefore, how does that work? What process does that kick off? Or again, similar to the types of data subjects, if you want to say, no, you draw down from ROPA as to what sort of transfers you're doing, and if it's not on the list, that then kicks off a process to assess that and look at that. Is that appropriate? Is that the legitimate thing to do? Those sorts of things. So already we're starting to see that one can feed the other, but which way round you do it depends on you and your organization, your pressures, what you want your systems to do, whether you are using Excel, whether you want to use something else, whatever it might be, tailor it to your needs and what you want it to do. I'm a firm believer that ROPA, everyone should be doing it. So I don't agree with the exemptions at all. I think everyone should be doing it because it's amazing. But make it work for you. How does it work? What do you want it to do to help you manage personal data? Now, all this is with a personal data hat on, but the logic can be applied for any type of data. So if it works well for personal data, see if you can then adapt it for other types of data as well. Because again, that process, that approach will work for any. So see how it works. With your data types, again, similar sort of thing. Does it feed to the asset register or does the asset register feed from ROPA? Same sort of logic with your retention schedule. Do you actually want to say that the retention schedule feeds ROPA and feeds your asset register, and that it's a defined list and that's it? Or do you again want to say that yes, you can pull from the list, but if you want to input something that isn't one of these things, that then kicks off a process and kicks off a way of recording whatever it might be. Same with your technical measures. Where do they sit? Are they something that sits in your asset register? Do they sit in your risk registers? Because again, technical measures are control measures. Therefore, and we put control measures in to manage risk. So do they actually sit technically, and there's the more an accurate list in your risk management program, and they sit within there? In which case, how does that pull across? Can it pull across? Or is it something that where it just needs to talk to one another and one feeds the other? Same thing with your other measures. Where do they sit? Now, if you've seen the ICO's copy, and I deliberately put it on the slide in this sort of scale so you could see how colossally huge it was. This is their template or ROPA for controllers. I've not done the processors one because it's a smaller, a scaled down version. So for controllers, which most of us are in one form or another, you'd have to do this, do both. So how does that work? So if you've not had a look at that particular ROPA template, and it has been revised a couple of times, so do go and if you've not looked at it in over a year, go and have a look at it today, because it has had a couple of additions. So go and have a look and see what's on there, and there is a lot. It's asking you for a lot more than what the ROPA in GDPR does. So for example, I'm calling it ROPA Plus. ROPA Plus asks you, what's the business area? So what business area is this that's doing this processing? What privacy notices relate to this processing? Can you link to them? Where are they stored? Do you store them centrally on your website? Do you store them in a SharePoint site and version control them as you would a policy or a document? Where do you store them for those? Again, is there a way of when people are filling in their asset registers around what processing they're doing, am I relying on a privacy notice? Can they select them? Can they point to where they are? Is that possible? If they say there isn't one and they need to create one, does that kick off a process? Those sorts of things. What would be normally be a manual process is actually, you've highlighted this, that's kicked off an action, a workflow, I think it's called in various different places. What agreements are there that cover that processing? So data sharing agreements, data processing agreements, where are they? Can you access them? What's your lawful basis? So building on purposes, what's then the lawful basis for that type of processing? Where are your records of consent? Where are they stored? Who's looking after them? Where's your subject access request records? Because it's asking for records of SARs. It's asking for records of DPIAs. It's asking for records of breaches. And it's asking for records of your policy documents. So it's asking for quite a lot of information, some of which might be in your asset register. So your information asset register will often pick up the business area that's responsible for it, or at least using it. Your privacy notices, do they stay on the website? Do you have a separate record database for those so that you can version control them and capture those? How does that work? Can you point to them easily? The same with your agreements. Do they actually sit in a contracts database? Because I bet you bottom dollar, if you say to someone, I want a copy of all data processing agreements, your contracts team will say, yeah, sure, but it's in this database. So we might give you a feed from that, but that's about it. So how do you know where they sit? Or is it appropriate that there's actually a separate repository for those that links to the contracts database, but is separate? How do you want to do that? Either way, it's something that you'll get asked for, and may even be something that you rely on to prove you've done something or not done something. So where's that? How does that work? Lawful basis, do you want to keep that in ROPA? Or is it something that, again, your information asset register could pull out? And if you know that most of your lawful bases are 1, 2, 3, or 4, and someone's now trying to use 5, does that kick off a process? Does that kick off an alert or a, oh, you want to use legitimate interests and you're in a public authority, red alert, don't do that. Or even, I bought myself one of these, bad idea. Those sorts of things. Obviously you don't want to do that, but I jest. What about your consent records? Do you keep them in the CRM? So if you've got consent as part of an application form, that application form will often be kept as part of your main customer database for that particular housing purpose or benefit purpose or whatever. So where do the consent records sit with that? Do you physically need to keep a copy of the consent record as part of that? Therefore, how do you point to it? Or is it something that's kept separately because it's a separate form or a separate whatever? And again, that will be very based on your consent processes, how you do it, whether you do it via an electronic system or whether you do it via digital contracts, paper contracts, whatever. Your STAR records, I imagine most of you have some sort of SAR management system, like a database, a disclosures database, an SAR database, that sort of thing. Therefore, how do you link the two together? So if the ICO does want to see, okay, for these records, show me this, can you link between the two? Or is that not possible? Those sorts of things. You probably have some sort of DPA's register or database or numbering system of some degree. How does that work? Does that integrate with your ROPA and your information asset registers? Should it? Can it? So coming back to the point earlier on, if someone does declare that they are now processing something or have recorded an asset that wasn't on your lists before and now is, does that kick off some sort of assessment process, be that a DPA process or other? How do those two work to help? Those sorts of things. Breaches, you'll probably have some sort of security database. So how, again, do those two link together? Can they be linked together? In an ideal world, you want to be able to say, asset 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that was involved in this particular breach, and there have been 12 breaches involving that particular type of asset. Therefore, there's something wrong here. That way, then you can use that information for your own intelligence and your own forward thinking. But how do you track that? How do you relate the two together? Is that possible? Does that require a little bit of work? But it can be done because fundamentally, I don't know, payroll data is payroll data. It came from somewhere. It was generated by something. Therefore, tracking it back to its source, you could find that out quite easily. The same thing for your policy documents. Similar to your privacy notices and consent records, where are they? How are they version controlled? Who looks after them? Where's the central store of them? And then how do you link them back so that if someone is declaring that they are using substantial public interests or employment to process special category data or any crime-related data stuff, then how is that stored? How is that managed? Can you link the two back together so that you say this policy document covers all these processing and potentially all these assets? How does that work? That way, then if someone wants to do something different with that asset, a change, we can deal with that. We can say, right, that's a change. That's not in the policy document. Why is that a change? Why is that legitimate? Or is it something that we need to challenge or something that we need to change the policy documents for? Can be done. There are links there. It will be complicated. So to quote JFK, it will be complex. It will be difficult. There's lots of interdependencies here. But if you can see the connections in your head and you can see how things link together and how something should kick off something else, start to map out how you want to make ROPA work for you and what a good records of processing activities database. Can we call it something else? Records of processing just sounds really bureaucratic. It's a horrible name for something that's actually really, really useful. So if you're already, just by those ideas and questions and evangelism that I've just put out there, if you're already starting to see the connections and see the possibilities, it's then just another step to say, right, well, what does that then look like in real life? How could I make that work? Is it something that's manual and Excel-based? Is it something where a system could help me? And I'll come back to the trappings and practicalities of that a little bit later on. So let's now look at your retention schedule. What should be in there? So everyone does retention schedules differently. So what all I've done is say, right, well, these are the basics. If you want to do a very, very basic retention schedule, these are the basic stuff that's in there. Everyone else adds different things in, and whatever you add into your own imagination. So you've got the description of what the file is, what the record is. You've got details of what format it's in, paper, electronic, database, blah, 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 blah. You've got then the legal basis or justification for why it's kept that way. Is it a business interest? Is it a legal mandatory maximum minimum? Those sorts of things. You've got who owns the record. That could be a business area or a named person. You've got where it physically is, where it's physically being stored. You've got its retention period and what happens at the end of that period. So at the very, very basic level, this is what would be in your retention schedule. So the description of what it is, that is all. Some of that will also be in your information asset register. Then that may also then be in your ROPA. So there'll be similarities between all three. Is it appropriate that there's similarities between all three, or does what the description that's in your retention schedule, is that description more high level than it is down into the specifics of an asset? Is it appropriate that it's high level, or is it more appropriate that it gets more specific into that of an asset? Again, either way would work. As when we talk about buckets, the big buckets versus small buckets, it's that sort of logic. So how would that work? You've then got your legal basis, your reason for keeping it. Well, a lot of that should be in what can relate to personal data. Some of that will overlap with what's in your records of processing. So who feeds what? Does the retention schedule feed what's in ROPA, or does the ROPA feed what's in the retention schedule? Or do they actually talk to each other and they feed each other? Same with the format that it's in. That'll often overlap with what's in your asset register. Same thing with who owns it. That might be potentially in your asset register, or you could say, no. For us, the record owner will always be different to the asset owner. There might be some overlaps, but generally the two will be different. Fine, that's an approach. Making them the same is an approach as well. Different ways of doing it. So how do you want those to overlap, or not at all? Where it's physically stored, that will definitely be in your asset register. Therefore, one could feed the other, and vice versa. And again, if someone then says, my asset, I'm declaring it now to be in, I don't know, this location, but the retention schedule doesn't pick that up or doesn't record that, does one override the other? Does one supersede the other? Say, you can't do that. You've declared you're going to store it in China. The retention schedule or the records of processing says you can't do that. And does that flag something? What's the retention period itself? That'll often be often defined by the schedule. Sometimes it might be defined by the information asset register, based on what is a business appropriate retention for keeping certain things. Especially when you start talking about stuff that isn't business, isn't personal data, but business data. So how do those two interact with one another? And then what's the end action? That's often detailed in your schedule. It might actually be detailed in your technical and organizational controls as part of your controls for keeping it secure. So again, the two could feed one another and overlap. There's lots of really valuable. We often in IRM, we often spend a lot of time focusing on other people's data, but actually the data that we collect in order to manage our information assets, our records of processing, our retention schedules, that data, that metadata is really, really useful. And there's lots of overlaps with it. So can we try and harmonize that in some way so that when we fill in one, it helps fill in and match the other one? Again, something to chew on. So when we then look at your information asset register, and again, there's loads of different types out there, loads of different ways of doing it, loads of different ways that people approach it. One system, we've already had a couple of systems mentioned in the chat. They do it one way, some do it another way, loads of different ways of doing it. But based on what I've researched and what I've found, these are most of the things that most of them seem to contain. So they'll contain what the function is, what the organization function is that this asset relates to or is helping deliver, what activity is then within that function, what the asset name is itself, so what we're calling it, what the asset function relates to, the department owner, the owner itself, the admin. So if you've got an information asset administrator, someone that uses it day to day but isn't necessarily the owner. Its classification, its location, its format, its disposal method, its source, so where you got it from, its flow, its risks, and what controls we've put in place. So how do we secure it? Is it transmitted when it's flowing? Is it transmitted via encryption? You know, all those sorts of things. So it goes into a little bit more operational detail about what's physically happening with the specific asset. But again, there's lots of overlaps with your ROPA and with your retention schedule. So you might not necessarily have in your ROPA the asset or the organizational function, but you might do, depending on how it's been classified. So for privacy notices, for example, we'll often start them by function, and then we'll then delve into the specific activity or the specific thing within it. So there's already some bits already in there. Ruth says, I disagree with having formats in retention schedule, retention periods based on. Totally agree. And others have them in. Different ways of doing it. I think format should be in the asset because it's more operational than it is with the schedule. People do it in different ways because people are storing that metadata, that data field in different places. So when you're looking at harmonizing all three, is it, to your point, Ruth, more appropriate to store it actually in the asset register so it doesn't need to be in the retention schedule because the schedule and the register talk to one another and they are a reflection of each other. So rather than me duplicating it or storing it in the asset and the schedule, I can store it in the asset register, and that's fine. That meets my purpose. That meets my reasons for working. That works better for staff. Done. And see what's what. The same with your activity. That could be in the register, could be in your ROPA, could be in your privacy notices. Asset name, function, the department owner. That again should be something that's also potentially in other places, or is it appropriate that it actually stays in the information asset register and other places just get their feed from it? So if I have a query about something that's being used for, I don't know, payroll related stuff, then I then go to, my asset register tells me that's that person. I need to go and speak to them about that. Does that work? Same with who the owners are, the admins. That's also good for, earlier on, someone made a point around breaches equals people and people equals breaches. Same sort of thing for this. If I've got a list of people that are using that data, I have a breach and you haven't declared that particular team or person is using that data, was it even appropriate that they were using it in the first place? I've got metadata to map that up. Or if it was appropriate they were using it in the first place, that's tick number one. Then the how they were using it, so my organizational controls, were any of those breached? So were they not following their training, their guidance, their this, their that, the other, those sorts of things. Its classification, we tend to put classifications more in the asset register than we do in anything else. And again, that could be totally appropriate that it's been in there, but it could draw itself or draw a classification from the ROPA. If you've said there's sensitive personal data in there, it automatically gets classified as this. So if someone does say, oh, I'm using special category data in here, but I've declared its sensitivity as, I don't know, official rather than official sensitive for local government classification or government classification, does that flag a problem? Does that flag an alert to say someone's done this? Is that appropriate? Does that require an exception? Is that a risk to be accepted? What is it? Same thing with its location. We know that's stored in other places. So how do they talk to each other? Format, disposal method, source. Risks could actually sit in a risk register. And if they do, how do they talk to one another? Or is it appropriate that they do sit with the asset register and each risk is associated to an asset? Similarly, are assets associated to certain risks? Because if you know, for example, that your encryption software isn't great and has problems, then it could be that you say, okay, what are all the different risks that are reliant on that control? Can I track risks, assets, and controls together? So if there's a problem with it, I know I need to speak to all these different asset owners because they've declared that one of their controls is encryption. How do I do that? That's the ideal way to get to. That way, then, if a control fails, you can look at your risks and your asset registers straight away and say, right, you've all declared, run a search, you've all declared that this control you're heavily reliant on. This control I know is failing. Therefore, I need to speak to you all, contact you all, or even get an automatic notification. This control no longer works. You need to do something. It could be then you even store things in other places. Totally agree, David. So David's put a comment there. There's a lot of confusion around what an information asset is. It could be this. Some people think it's the system. Some think it's the data within it. And you're absolutely right. Because it's really difficult to define what an asset is to different organizations. Because if you go to a 10-person school, their approach to it is going to be wildly different to a 10,000 county council or government department. So it's really difficult to try and put a classification or a definition on it. But in terms of what we track about it, what we record about it, the metadata about it, there are some commonalities between the different systems that we've got that could help one another and help manage whatever that asset is that we have defined. And then kind of for the purposes of this discussion, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole because that's a whole different conversation. But for the purposes of an asset, however you define it, this supporting metadata will work. And we could have that. That's one of those conversations you have down the pub because you'll never come to an agreement on it, but you'll have a fascinating discussion about what one is and what isn't, and everyone's different approaches to it. So there'll be other systems or knowledge stores or metadata systems that will have things that you can pull on as well. So your risk registers, as we talked about just now, they'll have details about what risks, who owns those risks, controls, who owns the controls. They're all things that we need and rely on as part of our information asset management stuff and our records of processing. The ICO wants to know what controls were in place, what risks did you have around this asset? Was it reasonable for this particular incident to occur? Was it something you could have avoided? Whereas if it wasn't on your radar at all, was that appropriate that it wasn't on your radar at all? Or was it just something that just slipped through the net and wasn't picked up? Same thing with your supplier database. There'll be stuff on there around your third parties, how old their contracts are. We were having a conversation, me and Sarah, before we started around legacy contracts and how sometimes it's really difficult to get all of them done within a time period. So does your supplier database give you information around what suppliers you've got, how old the contracts are, and therefore quantifies the problem? So even if you know that getting to all of your suppliers, because you've got 100,000 of the damn things, is going to take you a while, can you link to that database somehow, or that knowledge somehow, so that you can then say, right, what are my high profile ones? What in my information asset register or my records of processing is showing that these types of people, these types of third party suppliers or partners are my high risk ones. Therefore, I'll pick on them first. I'll agree a plan. I'll quantify it so that if something goes wrong, I've got something to defend myself with. I've got a plan. I've got an action plan. Rather than saying, that's too complicated. Far too many of them can't do that. What the ICO is looking for and what other areas are looking for, and other areas of regulation as well, not just personal data, is do you have a plan? Have you quantified the problem? And are you then reacting to it accordingly? Same thing for your information security management system. Your breaches may well be in that. So if you have implemented some sort of ISMS, how do your breaches relate back to your assets in there? Can they talk to one another in some form? Can they talk to your risks? Because fundamentally an incident is a control failure. So what controls failed? What risks that relate to? Your disclosures database, your DPIA database. What else? What other systems have you got, or processes that you've got, or registers that you've got that help you manage personal data, high employee salary registers? What is there that can help you manage your information assets, your incident logs? Have a look, see, when you've got that vision of what you want good to look like, and how your records of processing, your asset register, and your retention schedule are working for you, not against you, or at least give the impression they're working for you, not against you, what else are you reliant on? What other information do you need? And then who do you need to butter up and make alliances with to make sure that you get that data? So the power of three, technically it's the power of multiple, or the power of many. There's lots of different metadata across loads of different places. But calling the power of many just sounds a bit pants. So we're going to call it the power of three. The power of your records of processing, the power of your information assets, and the power of your retention schedule. Have a think to see how they can work for you. How they can actually, rather than storing everything in one or relying heavily on the one in all three, how do they feed one another? How do they interact with one another? Because there are some things where that particular thing, so for example, if we just take the basics of what's in a records of processing, some of it might actually be generated by the ROPA itself, because you'll know what some of your things are. Some of it might actually be generated by the information asset register when the business declares what it's doing or what it's not doing. Some of your purposes may even be defined by your retention schedule, because if you've determined that there are some things you need to keep for 75 years for whatever different reasons, some of that might be driven by what's documented in your retention schedule. So it could be across all three. Whereas who you are, the different entities involved, that will often be driven by, or mainly stored in your ROPA, but it might also be stored in your IAR. Who does this asset belong to? Is it ours or someone else's? Those sorts of things, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go through all of them because we're running out of time, but what or which of the three generates that content, and which of the three, is it appropriate for it to generate that content, or is it appropriate that they generate that content together? Therefore, how do they talk to one another, and how do they rely on one another? Is that a manual process? Is that an electronic process? If you just take something simple, something really mundane like a payslip. So copies of payslips. We know that it's an asset on the payroll database. So staff can access it, they can download a copy of their payslips, we can use it for reference for tax purposes, blah, blah, blah. It's an asset that we store, we manage, and it could be in either paper or electronic, depending on your systems and how you do it. That will appear in your records of processing, because to pay you is a legitimate purpose. That's got personal data in it. It's something that's got someone's national insurance number in it. So there are data protection risks around there. Because it's a defined piece of information, it's an asset. Therefore, the list of the pay slips, be that in paper or electronic, may well then sit in your information asset register, either, to David's point, as payroll system and lumped in as one, or marked separately as no, this lookup table or this particular table of copies of paper slips, that's one asset, and then everything else. But either way, it's in there and it's stored in there. Same thing with your retention schedule. How long do you keep them for? How long do you keep employee pay slips for? That will have a listing in your retention schedule as well. So just pay slips, employee pay slips, will appear across all three, and there'll be commonalities across all three. They may even appear in your disclosures log, because if you've shared a pay slip with, I don't know, HMRC for some reason, or some other reason for fraud, a fraud investigation or whatever, that will appear in there. If it's outsourced to a third party, so you've outsourced payroll, then the payroll pay slips database and that asset will sit with the third party. So there'll be a contract that governs that. So that will be in a contract database. So your pay slips will appear there, or the related to pay slips will appear there. If there's any incidents relating to it, pay slips gone to the wrong person, someone's hacked into the database, whatever, that'll appear in your incidents database. It will appear in your risks, because it's an asset that you've got to manage. Therefore, if I'm doing it digitally, there are loads of risks there. If I'm doing it via paper, there are loads of risks there. So it'll appear with there as well. And ideally, whether it's legacy or new, there'll be a DPIA that relates to that information as well, and how that's being processed and used. So that one payslip, that one little asset, could appear across all of them. Now, it's the same asset, it's the same set of documents, it's the same bit across all of them. So all of these different systems, how all these different methods, rather than using the word system, methods and priorities and focuses, how do we try and align them so that they can just see one asset. Because again, it'll appear across all of them. Therefore, how do I get it so that if something happens to that payslip and someone comes a knocking, be that Elizabeth Denham or other, how do I get it so that that payslip is accurately reflected across all of my different ways of doing it, across my priorities around disclosures, information assets, incidents, contracts, risks, blah, 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 so that when something happens to that asset, I can easily track it back to where it's gone for different places. Oh, I like that. Graham's throwing in the metaphor about the bookcase system and how we migrate things over time and move books from one thing to another. You might see it on different shelves, but it's still the same book. It's still the same book. So therefore, how do we replicate that? And how do we make sure the authenticity of that, so that if I've got, I don't know, the complete backlog of T.S. Eliot, that it remains marked as the complete backlog of T.S. Eliot that talks about this, this, and this. Some of the different ways that I've seen do it is what some people tend to do is that in their ROPA, they'll talk about employee data. So we collect employee data, okay, for the purposes of employment. Okay, fine. They'll then put sub data types in there. So they'll say, right, it's employee data, big umbrella type thing. Within that, you've then got data relating to the provision of payroll. So you've kind of got what the data is, then it's a sub-purpose, and then you've got a specific type, a specific asset. So employee data exists for the purposes of providing payroll, and to provide payroll, certain assets exist, which include your pay slips. So we mark it as employee data, payroll, pay slips, 1.2.1, however you want to do it. Loads of different ways of doing it, but it's subcategorized. So we think of the big bucket up top, and then we work down into smaller buckets to then find what it is that we're looking for and what it is that relates to. That way then, whether it is a DPIA, a retention entry, whatever, that sort of logical big bucket, medium bucket, little bucket might work. Some people go straight into the big bucket, fine. If that's working for your organization, it means you can pinpoint across, do that. Some people go into the smaller buckets. Again, if that works for your organization and it means you can pinpoint what you want, do that. I'm a big advocate of whatever works for you. So now that I've thrown all that into the mix and probably bamboozled you massively, number one, sorry. Number two, not sorry. Number three, what's stopping you? So this, trying to work out what good looks like to you and for your organization. What are the roadblocks? What are the things that would stop you, either A, from getting there, or B, from even just working out what good looks like? So before we even look to get there, what stops you from even working out what good looks like? What are the roadblocks? Volume. So one of the responses there says volume. There's just so much stuff. And you're right. So what we tend to do is break it down into chunks to say, right, can we actually, rather than look at the biggest problem, there's a film, I think it's called Deep Impact, that says, don't think about the prospect of trying to save the world and the billions of people in it. Relate it back to saving your family. Break it down into small chunks. So what does good look like for a particular purpose? HR, payroll. What does good look like for IG? So IG's assets, IG's retentions and whatever else. So even your own department, what does records management and this power of three look like for you and your department? That way then, if you can map that out for your own department, for what your own pressures are, you can then see, someone's just put there, what senior management buy-in you might need, because you might need time, resources, money, whatever it might be. But it then gets you used to, or gets you into the habit of looking at, well, what are my quick wins? What are the things that I could do, little things to change and improve things? And what are my bigger things that I need X and Y and Z for? It's that whole thing of, you don't go to the supermarket and buy Sunday dinner. You buy elements of Sunday dinner. Therefore, plan it out. What do you need to make your dinner? You need this, this, and this. Some of this Sainsbury's will have, some of this Tesco's will have. Therefore, I'll go there first and then go there first. Some of this next door has, so I'll ask them. That sort of stuff. Break it out into manageable chunks. That way then, so some of the responses we've had have said, people, yeah, they are a pain. People, not a fan. Lack of resources, yeah, still chestnut, but it's true. One of the things that I got taught from one of my old senior directors was she's not interested in reasons why it can't be done. She wants to know, what do you need? So you've said it's too difficult, it's too complicated, there's too many barriers in the way. Okay, what are those barriers? What is stopping you? Give me a vision of what good looks like, and then what we need to do to get there. If it's to one of the points that just raised just then, incompatibility of systems, lack of appetite, you can then quantify, well, how do I change that? So if I've got a problem of lack of appetite with senior management, what can I do to change that? What can I do to improve that? Are there some things I just cannot do? So, for example, a lady's just put in there cross-functional working, silos. We've got an issue with that. Okay, I can't solve that on my own. I need other departments to work with me on that, to try and stop siloed working, those sorts of things. It just quantifies the problem. Otherwise, the problem's an anecdote. It's something that's everyone agrees is there and everyone knows is there, but it isn't a tangible hand-on thing that we can wrap our hands around and say, right, what do I need to do to fix this? What's the path I need to put the authority on, or the organization on, to get there? What can I do? What's within my realm to change? What can I influence versus what is stuff that I need other people to influence? Therefore, how can I influence them? How can I get their buy-in to what I'm doing? So don't think that everything has to be you and there's all this stuff is placed on you, but you can be a motivator, a prodder, an encourager, a source of knowledge, as someone that can just move it along, bits and pieces, with your allies and with everyone else to get it to where it needs to go. Conscious of time, so I'm going to move on. So one of the questions that was thrown into the mix then, as we've just been talking about here as well, is how do we make this sexy? How do we sell this idea of the power of three? Because we're all geeks. So we're all, really riled up by what we've been talking about. So yeah, it's really good, blah, 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 blah. And we've been having some great discussions around what an asset is and all that great stuff. But that's us. And that's inward looking. So how do we outwardly look so that the business that's got 1,001 different other priorities, how do we get them to have the same sort of enthusiasm for what we've got? For the record, this is not a photo of me. No comment, Stephen. First and foremost, perception is projection. So if you are putting out into the world, this is too much work, this will never work, this is far too many problems, other people will see that. Other people will feed off that. Because fundamentally, this is our bread and butter. So if we're putting out into the world, no, it's too difficult. No, it's too difficult. Then that's what the business is going to think as well. We have to be, and it is difficult, and I've been there, and then trust me, through COVID, I've stared into the darkness. We've got to be a bastion of positivity. This can work. Small steps. These are the benefits for this. These are the benefits of that. Whereas if we don't do that, we will just see problems, and that's it. And therefore, the business will see problems, and that's it. So it does pay off. It seems like one of those cheesy cat poster things, but it does work. It does pay off. Psychologically, we are what we project, and the world around us is what we project. Therefore, if we're projecting problems, we're projecting that's never going to work, issues, don't want to know, oh my God, the world's going to end. Funnily enough, other people feed off that, and other people will take that as, well, if you're not even convinced by it, then my God, why should I be? You're meant to be the champion of this, and if you're not a champion, then why should I? So it is about little things, small steps of positivity, small steps of active promotion, little things. If we've just did it this way, that could work better than that. Little wins. So yes, where we talked about earlier on that the problem is big because we're a big organization, a big authority, loads of different stuff. Small wins. Track your small wins. Little things like I changed someone's mind. Someone was anti doing their asset registers. Now they aren't. We got this department done and they've always been a pain in the backside. All those sorts of things. Track them, reward them, encourage them. It shows that you are making a difference. You are making a change. The power of 3 compels you. Is that evangelical? I could do like a big hands in the air, but that's not really me. It's just me and the cat, so, you know. Build relationships and alliances. They do pay off. Politics. It does pay off. Favors. You help me out, I'll help you out. Food corruption or food bribery, I'm a massive supporter of. Works everywhere. It is the language of most businesses. Therefore, if you can use that to your advantage, do it. Don't be afraid to ask. If you don't ask, you don't get. I'm a firm believer of that. If you don't ask for something, you won't get it. If you assume the answer, what does your mother say? Assuming makes an ass out of you and me. Therefore, don't assume. Ask. Build your case. If they say no, fine, they say no. We can deal with that and we can work with that. Whereas the assumption means you've trapped yourself in a box without ever knowing whether they're going to say yes or not. Ask. Don't ask, don't get. So be bold, be brassy, do it. Just listen to Yoda. What does good look like for you? Don't just say, we're going to try that, see if it works. We're going to try that, see if it works. Do it. Do or do not. There is no try. Use the negatives to your advantage. So where things go wrong, risks have been raised, whatever it might be, add that to your list of things that you're looking at. Use it to your advantage. Speak to the organization's language. Because if they're concerned about, I don't know, data leakage or councillors doing whatever or whatever it might be, can we frame what someone's doing in that sort of language? Those sorts of things. See your opportunities. The power of 3. So work out what works well for you and work out what's stopping you. What's in your way? And then see if there are things that you can put in place to change that. So before we wrap up, let's look at some of the questions because I want to pull and answer some of the questions before our time is up. So let's have a look. Let's start with the first ones. I think this is in time order. So are we recording the session? I think so. You are indeed. Marvellous. And that will appear on YouTube. How do you get buy-in with an asset or with asset and email management? Why does it sometimes feel like I'm failing with this aspect? Well, you're not the only one. It's one of those where we talked about earlier on about we are very guilty at saying the problem's too difficult, we don't want to deal with it. Well, senior execs and senior people and other managers are guilty of that as well. When you say to them, we want to do email asset management, they know the size of their email inbox and they immediately see a lot of work, a lot of headache, a lot of problems. So how can we break that down into manageable chunks? How can we do it in bits so that for them that don't see the world like that, or that can't see past the amount of work that would be involved, how do we put it in frame it in a different way so that they see smaller chunks, smaller steps to get to the bigger problem? Otherwise, they'll just see, God, my inbox is an absolute nightmare. That sounds like a headache. No, we're not doing that. Got 1,000 things to worry about. Not going to deal with that particular headache. Frame it in a different way. If you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always got. So try something different. Frame it in a different way. Break it up into a smaller chunk. Do a trial department. Get someone on board first. Use that as an example. If it's doable, in smaller, manageable chunks, small steps to get to where you need to go. That could be one way of doing it. Does anyone use, so one of the questions in there was, does anyone use DP management software? And a few of you have been putting your software suggestions in there, so continue to do that. So for Michelle's benefit, if you use a particular software and you like it and you'd recommend it, throw that into the chat. And Michelle can have a look and see what ones are there. Obviously, I'm the presenter, so I'm not going to put on one or the other. There are loads available. Challenge yourself. There's software for IAR, DPAs, breach logs, etc. Is there good software that anyone is using for producing a retention schedule beyond Excel or Word without other special software? So again, for Sean's benefit, if people are using some software in there for a retention schedule, throw that into the chat so Sean can have a look. I haven't seen many. Most of the ones I've seen tend to revolve around Excel, but we'll see. David says, I'm not really clear why both a ROPA and an IAR are required. Why can we not just list the processing activity within the IAR, i.e. payslips are the information asset, and this is what processing we do with them? Totally agree. Totally agree. So if you wanted to merge the two together and say, right, the bits of the ROPA and the bits of the asset register, we're going to merge together, as long as you can clearly pull out what you need for a ROPA and show it as such. I think that's why the ICO's template is so massive, because it's almost as big as an information asset register. Do that. Merge the two together. That then the power of 3 has eaten the 1. That sounds weird. But you see what I mean? That could work quite legitimately. As long as you're able to produce what you need to produce, whether it's one, multiple, different tabs within one, whatever works for you, do it. Crack on. Graham says, are there any really innovative and interesting ways to show an IAR ROPA that I've seen? There are. We almost got to one. So when I was at Essex, we were developing our own in-house system, and we were almost there. And the funding got pulled, like most things in life. And then they restructured, and I left, and life happened. So not that I've seen. Most of the ones I've seen are either an information asset register with some ROPA bits thrown in. They are a data flow or a data mapping piece of software, or they're a retention schedule piece of software. I'm yet to see, or they're a privacy management piece of software that does have bits and pieces of all of it, but not really. I'm yet to see something that would work as a personal data IAR and a business IAR and include ROPA for the personal data stuff and the retention schedule for business and personal. I'm yet to find one that presents all of that in a friendly format that's easy to use. Most people tend to be doing it either with their own in-house system and developing it themselves, or it does bits and pieces of which. Happy to see if others have done it as well, but whether others have actually seen some that do it, but in my experience, no. So if you've seen one, plop it into the chat so Graham can have a look and everyone else can have a look. Let's see what's what. I'm going to build on to that. Sean then asked the question around innovative retention schedules. I like that. I'm desperate for one. All right, okay. Similar sort of thing. But some of the ones I've seen have been interactive, so they chop and change based on what you're doing and how you're doing it, or they're part of the IAR. So your retention schedule actually is just an extract from the IAR. I've seen that. But as for something that's all singing or dancing is pleasurable on the eye, I'm not aware of one, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. There may well be ones knocking around. So let's have a look at some of the other chat bits. OneTrust has been thrown in from Stephen. Inform you. Ruth's just going through a process of procuring a system that does things like agreements for multi-agency sharing agreements. There we go. Joint controllers and processors, but she doesn't know if it's local or whether it's national. So that's something to might be consider. Graham's got some ones that he's thrown in there as well. So there are some bits, and it tends to be a bit more of a jigsaw at the moment. Part of the reason why I didn't want to say this is the final product and say you need to do this. Instead, what I wanted to do was just do a little bit of, well, let's look at the ideal world and see if we can together collectively in our own organizations and as a profession start to work towards some of that and see what bits work well with either within our own organizations or others, to then see what we could share and how we can get to that ideal world of making the most of the power of 3 and selling others on the power of 3 or 2, depending on your point of view, as well. So some little tidbits. If you've got some additional questions, throw them in there. But some wrap-ups from me. If you've not studied the ISTO template on ROPA, go and have a look at it. If you've not touched it in over a year, go and have a look at it to make sure what you're doing is still in line with that template. Are you recording, you're processing your assets and your retentions in a consistent manner? Is that one of your quick wins? Is it one of those things where you can start to align all 3, but they're not quite merged yet, but they are similar. Therefore, you're halfway there. those sorts of things. What do you need to be able to feed one data from one system to another? Is it something you just want to merge, as I think it was Stephen talked about, merging the two, or actually is it that you don't want to keep them separately? So how do they talk to one another? Is it easy to find and request stuff from your ROPA and other systems? And fundamentally, what does good look like to you? Take the time, go down the pub, have a chat with your team. What does good look like to you? Get that down on paper. Make it visual, audio, written down, whatever. Make it so that you can then see what the future looks like. And you can then see where you are in comparison to that. So your then journey, you can then map out the steps. The quick and easy wins versus the long term, I need to work on you. I need to annoy you every single day until you agree to what it is I want you to do. Those sorts of things. Agree your strategy and see what's what. So I'm firmly sold on the power of 3, and hopefully I've thrown enough bombs out there, thought bombs out there, to make you think about how can the power of 3 really work for you.
Okay, thank you very much, Scott, for what's been an absolutely brilliant session. I can see from the chat that people have had a really amazing time. What we did with some of the questions with our first session was start to populate the forums. So Sarah and I will look at the questions and see if we can put some of the answers to the questions up on the forums as well. But I'd like to say very much very many thanks to Scott for running the session, which has been absolutely brilliant, and hopefully I will look forward to seeing people in August when it will be Richard Jeffrey Cook who is going to talk about some aspects of SharePoint. So thank you very much, Scott, and I hope everyone has a very pleasant afternoon.
Thank you all.
Bye.